Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today we'll be drawing a portrait with my oil pastels. I've been really wanting to try them again, and now it's finally time. The paper that I'm using is my Strathmore toned paper, and the oil pastels are actually two sets, one from Arrtx and one from Rubens, and I will talk more about that later. I want to first start off with my actual process, and I was somehow not really that conscious of myself using the toned paper. So when I first planned this whole thing, and even when I think about for the future using toned paper for my gouache paintings, I always think that it would alter my process so much, but for this it didn't really. I do think that I should have been more conscious of the paper being toned, because after this I had to adjust a lot of things. It's just to remind myself that I'm working in mid-tone, so there are so many things that I needed to add. But yeah, oil pastels have always felt like a very intimidating medium to me, and so even though I've had my first set for almost a year now and the second one for maybe 4 months, this is only my third work with oil pastels. In theory, they just seem so different from gouache and all of the other mediums that I work with, but when you really think about it, it's not that much different from gouache, except for the technical stuff. The only big difference between the two that is significant is actually the fact that gouache shifts in colors when it dries, while oil pastels will stay the same color. So I don't know why it intimidates me until I actually get to try it. As a YouTube artist too, I always feel like there's always a pressure to only work with what your audience already likes to see. And that's why gouache has been such a big thing in my channels, because before I started, I didn't know that it was going to be this big thing in the community. So just when you're a creator, it's always easier to go with what you already know that your audience is going to like, or else a lot of your effort won't be paid back, because it does take a lot of time and resources to do these videos. So it's always easier to do what already works for you. One thing that has surprised me is that with both of my videos, they have seemed to work well and with the same audience, that is the people that already like my gouache videos. So I think that's really interesting, because I do think that that's because, just talking about the subscribers that I already know, I feel like we all know once we try gouache and oil pastels that there's really not that much difference between the two. I also think that there's a bigger difference between gouache and watercolors than gouache versus oil pastels, which is something that I have just thought of. Going back to this piece, it took me such a long time to figure out what to do with her face, because I was going off of a sketch rather than an actual photo. There is a photo that I worked with while I was doing the sketch, so a lot of the pose and like the positioning of the head is based off of the reference photo, and I will also have it linked in my Pinterest. But when I did the sketch digitally at first, I actually changed a lot of it, and I think when I just did it, I didn't really intend on translating it into another medium. It was just going to be a digital sketch. But just before I started this painting, I saw it on my iPad and I knew that I needed to do it with my oil pastels. So You can see, because I wasn't working off of a full photo, that her face sort of morphed into a few different faces before I figured out what she would really look like. It also took me a while to figure out the skin tones that I was going to work with, not really because of the colors that I have, but because I really wanted to experiment with the kind of shifts in colors there will be for her skin tone. Oil pastels, I feel like, is the only medium I work with where it really pushes me to try different things and to try different colors sitting next to each other and to just experiment with different combinations. And especially for skin tones, I just don't really experiment that much with my gouache. With gouache especially, I just mostly stick to the reference photo. So I think that's what makes my oil pastels just feel more special, is because I'm inspired to try different colors with it, and also just some unnatural looking colors I would try and see if I can put that into the skin tones, which is just something that I wouldn't even attempt with gouache. Oil pastels have just felt like a very fun medium to work with. I almost had this restless feeling during that first day when it took me so long to fill out the whole page, just because when you're painting, this is the fastest stage to do because of how paint just spreads across the paper. This first stage was the hardest for me with the oil pastels because you have to actively draw and scratch out every single color that you put on the paper. So it took a while to do that. And this one is also bigger than my more recent painting, so that took its toll too. What I was having trouble with was picking the colors, and it took me an embarrassingly long time to figure out that the paper label that's encasing the pastels is a different color from the actual pastels. So it was so embarrassing for me to figure it out because it looks so obvious now. And that's why I was so baffled when I would go to pick out a color and it would look so different on the paper. I didn't notice this actually. I think the biggest reason why I didn't do that is because the difference between the color on the label versus the actual color of the pastels is almost the same as the difference between what gouache looks like when you're mixing it on the palette versus what it looks like when it dries. So it's a difference that my brain has already calibrated with. So it took me such a long time to figure that out. And on the second day was when I had that revelation. And so I just spent a lot of that day taking out the paper out of these oil pastels so I can really see what they look like bare and what they will look like on the paper. As soon as I figured it out is when everything went very smoothly. And it also was just easier the second day because this is something that I will always forget about oil pastels, but they also need time to dry like actual paint. So since it was already the second day and the first layer is already dried, it was easier to layer these next ones on top of it without moving the ones underneath. It's a very fascinating thing to witness because you don't really expect that from a dry medium, but it's so cool to experience, and especially when you get to feel what it feels like to work on top of wet oil pastels versus dry. The difference is just so crazy. The second day was also when I really knew where to go with her face, and so I got it to look like that first, and then I was just working my way on top of that. There's another thing that makes oil pastels similar to gouache is that you can either go from light to dark, which is awesome, especially for this sketch because I already knew that quality about oil pastels. I wasn't afraid to just play around with the colors and to let my future self figure out the details, and that is what happened with this one. So when I would decide to polish it up, it's fine because I knew that these pastels would just glide on top of each other still. whether I was laying darker colors on top of lighter ones or vice versa. That does get a little bit harder if you don't wait for the layers in between to dry, but as soon as you figure out the technicalities and the things that you need to work with oil pastels, it really does get so much easier. Now for the details, I'm not using my pen cup anymore. I finally found my palette knife and I'm just using that now to put in the details on top of still soft layers. You can layer these without waiting for them to dry, but for me I had to use my palette knife so that I'm really just depositing these very soft colors on top of each other without moving them too much. That would be very hard to do if I was just using my hands. It was really fun to try out different colors on top of a more natural base for the skin tones, and what allows me to do this is just, like I said, the versatility of oil pastels. It's how great they are to layer on top of each other, and it really inspires you to experiment. But another thing that I wanted to talk about, and which also makes this possible, is because of the difference between the Arrtx oil pastels versus the ones from Paul Rubens. When I first was asked to try them out, it was by the same person, and that's because Arrtx and Paul Rubens are, I think they're sister companies, that's what they're called. But really, when that person asked me if I wanted to try the Arrtx ones, I was almost inclined to just say no, just because I felt like it was gonna be the same thing, but maybe with just a little bit of different colors between them. But the ones I've tried these two sets simultaneously is when I really figured out the difference between the two. And you can see right here when I was putting down the details on her face, I was using mostly the Arrtx colors, and they are just so incredibly soft, and that's what makes them so easy to layer on top of my dried layers. But they also are a lot easier to layer on top of the Paul Rubens oil pastels, because those are just a little bit harder. This is a difference that didn't really occur to me. I did sort of notice it at first when I was trying out both for the first time, but I didn't notice how drastic it was until I tried both of them together for this piece. The Arrtx ones almost felt like I was working with paint. That's how soft it was. It's just so crazy how amazingly soft the Arrtx ones are compared to the Paul Rubens ones. I really wouldn't say that that's better, because the Paul Rubens ones are a lot easier to work with, I would say. When I think of just working with the Arrtx colors, I know that I would have to have a day in between the layers so that they would be workable. With the Paul Rubens, I didn't have to wait that long for them to dry, and so it was just so great to work with these two sets together. Wouldn't recommend it because I think that would be too expensive, but if you already had both of them, if you happen to, try and use them together. Even if it's not these two brands, I would also suggest just trying out different brands with each other to try and see how it would work out and how they would react to each other, because I really think that that was awesome how they work well with each other, and that was really unexpected for me. So after I've laid everything down and I figured out the colors for it, it was just so fun to take my palette knife and add in the layers on top of each other for the very last details. This was so fun. It almost felt like I was sculpting with the paint, with the pastels, and see how I have to correct myself, because I always think of these as paints because of how soft they are. But yeah, the last few steps are the most fun. It really felt like everything was coming together, and also oil pastels is just such a fun medium. If you're someone who paints a lot, I would actually recommend this because it's not that much different from painting. But yeah, I had such a fun time painting this. Hope you guys had fun watching it. That will be it for this one. Thank you guys for watching, and Thank you to my patrons for supporting me, and I will be seeing you guys again soon.